Hey, fellow knife aficionados, welcome back to the channel. Sorry about that. Today we're going to be talking about reproduction knives. What is a reproduction knife? Are they worth having? Are they worth EDCing? What is the collector value of these knives, if any, once you pick them up? And before we talk about that, let me first say hi to my foreign friends. Guten Tag, hola, bonjour, privet, and ciao to my foreign friends there. So I think before we talk about this, we need to understand what we're talking about when we talk about a reproduction knife. So when you say, hey, a reproduction knife, it's actually a class or family of knives within a group of knives. That group of knives falls under 4 different classifications: limited edition knives, special purpose, special issue knives, commemorative knives, and reproduction knives. And so it's important to understand those things before you really understand what a reproduction knife is. This knife right here, made by Schrade in 1776 to commemorate the 200-year anniversary of the American Revolution. This knife is not a reproduction of any knife. It's a commemorative knife. There's nothing special about this knife. It was a current model. What they did is add a different color scale to it. There's some, let me see if I can get it in. There's some etching there, Paul Revere. And then it has Paul Revere on a horse. And a really nice pewter emblem, by the way. Very detailed. Pretty nice. But, so that's a commemorative knife. And it also could be considered a limited edition knife because they only made so many. So a limited edition is a knife set that they put out and they only make so many of them. Here's another example of that. This is a commemorative knife, Jim Bowie, and they put this out basically to sell knives, but it's Jim Bowie marked on the blade. Really nice pewter Bowie, by the way. Really nice. And then on the back, a little plaque here. So these are commemorative knives commemorating an event. Usually those come out around the birth date of something. So knife manufacturers like to commemorate their 100th year, bicentennial, etc., by putting out a special knife. Oftentimes those knives are commemorative and limited editions because they only make so many of them. You can have a limited edition knife, a knife that's just made, and there's only so many of the knives made. So a reproduction knife differs in that it's replicating a specific model of knife. So this is a Remington bullet knife, and it's their 2-bladed trapper model. It's a model 1128, and you'll notice the Remington tang stamp on this knife. And that's another characteristic of a reproduction knife. And then on the back, there's a date on this knife. And on the other blade, you have the model number. So if we look back here, it's an R1128. So the model 1128 was a very large 4.5 inch trapper, 2-bladed trapper in Coca-Cola. And this knife closely approximates that knife, really close in size, in dimension, the number of blades, in adornment, the 30-aught caliber bullet shield. And in fact, I think probably the only thing this knife is not exact with the original knife is there was another pin here. So Remington used 4 pins. But this is a really close approximation, very close, of the original Remington Bullet 1128 Trapper. That is a reproduction knife. By the way, this was not released for any commemorative value whatsoever. Remington wanted to start producing knives, old pattern numbers that they no longer produced, and they commissioned Camillus to do that. They released one a year. All right, we're going to look at another one here in just a second. And this is another reproduction knife. You've seen it in my videos before. This knife is a reproduction of a really highly collectible and famous folding dirk by Edward Barnes. And you see again, that's Edward Barnes and Sons tank stamp. And Edward Barnes stamped his blades with US also. And when you look at this knife, I've looked at several different pictures of original Barnes knife, and this knife is exact in every detail. Very good reproduction of the Edward Barnes original knife. The only thing I can tell that's different on this knife, on the original Barnes, there were less grapes on the grapevine here. So it was a little less busy on the original Edward Barnes knife, the vine here. Otherwise, this is an exact copy. It's a beautiful representation of an old 1860 style dirk. And so, you know, why would you do that? Well, in the case of this knife, if you wanted an original bullet knife, Remington model 1128, you're in good shape. You're looking at $800 and up for the value of the knife. Even poor ones go for $400 and $500. So I wanted a copy of this knife. I wanted to see what it was like. This is a famous model knife. It's a transitional knife. And so that's why I bought it. I'm not a really big fan of reproduction knives, and I don't have a lot of them. As you can see, this is it, I think, pretty much. So that's what you get with a reproduction knife. Now, let's look at what's not a reproduction knife. So this is a Sunfish by Rough Rider. They've made no representation here to call this a reproduction knife. But you can tell it's an old pattern, right? It's an old Sunfish pattern or elephant toe pattern. And it's just an old pattern knife reproduced for nostalgic purposes. And this is another example. I bought this knife because I couldn't find a vintage one that I wanted to get. I wanted to get a hold of one and just see, you know, what was this pattern knife all about. It seemed kind of ridiculous to me, but actually once you get one of these, you realize, hey, this is a good knife. It's a good pattern, and it would be a great EDC knife. And you know, that's why you buy a knife like this, to get an example of that pattern. Here's another example of that. This is a bow trapper, two-bladed trapper. You can see the blade there, and it could be a curved jack or a bow trapper. I think bow trapper would be a better explanation of this knife. But again, it's not representative of any particular knife, just the pattern. And so it's not a reproduction. It's just a nostalgic type of knife put out to give you that look and feel of an old pattern of knife. Something people used to carry, they don't really carry anymore. And that's the difference between a reproduction and just an old pattern knife. Just because it's an old pattern doesn't mean it's a reproduction. So to me, reproductions have the original tank stamp, the original look, they're as close as you can get to the original knife. That Bowie knife in the background is another example of that. So that Bowie knife is a reproduction. And let me just pick it up here a minute. It's pretty big, but so this is a really, really famous Bowie knife, highly collectible, from a couple guys up in Philadelphia called, I think his name was Joseph English and Henry Hubbard. And both of them made knives like these up in Philadelphia. They made knives independently and they collaborated. And H. Hubbard is one of the guys who are associated with Jim Bowie, thought to have produced a knife for Jim Bowie. And if you look at this knife, every detail about this knife is as the original Bowie knife, except the tang stamp. So the tang stamp is the same mark as the original, but the original was a curved mark, came up and came down like that, and it had a Sheffield Works on it. So they're just trying to make people think these were made in England, and they weren't. The other thing about this Bowie is on originals, the blade, let me get it in here, the blade grind is higher up. So this is a lot lower than the original. And the other one, the original had it pretty much in the middle. And so this is a really good reproduction. And even the sheath is exactly like the original sheath. Pretty cool. So, why would you get a knife like this? Well, I can't afford to put out $30,000 plus to have a Bowie that was made in 1820 or 1830. And so the next best thing is a reproduction, right? And this gives you the look and the feel, and it's a good reproduction. So they're not always that way. Manufacturers have somewhat taken advantage of the market. Camillus, like Remington, wanted to produce one of their vintage models per year, a different one every year. What Camillus ended up doing is making a bunch of different models every year. And as it turned out, some of those models weren't made by Remington at all, and the model numbers were not the same. And so that's where you get into trouble. So you have to do your research a little and make sure the model you're interested in is a genuine vintage model. And this Scatton Morgan from Queen, it's a beautiful knife, and that's why I bought it. The pluses are it's the original size of original Coke bottle knives, and that's kind of hard to find. A lot of times nowadays they make these Coke bottle knives in 4-inch pattern on a 4-inch frame, and they were 5-inch and above frames that the original Coke bottles were made. As far as I know, Scatton Morgan never used this trademark on a shield. They did use it on blades and on the tang, but not on the shield. They used a keystone shield. The keystone symbol is Pennsylvania's state symbol, and that's what they used on their shields. The marking is correct, and over here, the F&W is fire and wire tested, and Scott Morgan did use that. And I think they also etched their blades fire and wire tested, among other etchings that they used. So this is not an exact model of any Scott Morgan knife that I'm aware of. I've seen they did make a Coke bottle knife. As I said, they had a keystone shield on it. And so that's what you have to be aware of when you're looking for reproductions, is knife companies will just produce a knife, put a maker's name on it, and say, that's a model. This here is a model. The original two-bladed trappers came out in bone and Coca-Cola wood. The 1123 was the jigged bone 2-bladed trapper model that came out at 4.5 inches. They made one called the Baby Bullet, and this is a copy of the Baby Bullet, which was model 1123. And if you look here, 2021, let me find it. Okay, if you look here, you see they have a R7352. Up into that range, into the 7,000s, Remington put those numbers on pen knives. So this is not a pen knife. I'm not sure where GEC got this number. Maybe it's a GEC number, but the original Baby Bullet would have been 1123. So it's not exactly like a Baby Bullet, but otherwise it is. It's 3.5 inches. It has 4 pins like the original. The original had a lanyard hold here, and this one does not. So this is a pretty good approximation. It's not exact, and the model number is wrong. And that's what you got to look for in reproductions. So I don't want to drag this video out. I just wanted to, highlight a few issues if you're looking for a reproduction knife. If you want it to be exact, fine. If you don't want it to be exact, there's a lot of opportunity to pick knives like these up who have a maker's name on it. That, for instance, I know Queen produced a lot of reproduction Robusons, and many of those models Robuson never made. They just put Robuson's tank stamp on a model that they produced, and that's what you have to watch out for. So I hope you found the video informative. I hope you enjoyed it. I'd really appreciate if you like and subscribe, especially if you'd like to see more content like this. And remember, you'll know the truth will set you free. And thanks so much for watching.